Hello and good morning to today's event, Role-Based Access Control in Therefore. My name is Jennifer Schmidt and I'm going to be the host for today's event. I cannot see or hear you, so if you cough, sneeze, or pick your nose, I will never know. But if you do have a question or comment, I would love to hear from you. You can type those in the Q&A box, question and answer box in your Zoom, and I will look at those when I have time, and I will answer them to the best of my ability. I'm also joined today by my colleague, Roman, who's a technical expert in Therefore. So if you ask me a tricky question I don't know the answers to, Roman will probably be able to help us. So I'm a member of Therefore's digital engagement team. If you do have a question or you're watching the recording of this webinar, you can reach out to me personally at Jennifer Schmidt at therefore.net. That's Schmidt with 2 T's, or at media@therefore.net. So in today's webinar, we're going to be covering role-based access control, which is the user security concept in Therefore. We want this webinar to be interesting and useful to anyone who will configure or administer Therefore, or is looking for more information on user security. So this webinar will function as a mini training session for anyone looking to refresh or improve the current knowledge of RBAC, role-based access control. I will assume that you're already familiar with basic functions of Therefore, and you have a good understanding of what a category, workflow, or a document is in Therefore. I'll go through best practice for security and show some techniques that you can use to create and manage a security concept within your Therefore system. Having said that, this webinar is based on the training content in the e-learning course. If you have already taken the security training e-learning course, much of the content today is going to be a repetition of what was in that course. And of course, it's always good to review your knowledge. For those of you who do not have access to our e-learning, maybe you're an end customer or you just haven't had the time to go through that e-learning course yet, this webinar today is going to be a really good way to get that knowledge that you haven't had yet. So you can definitely use this webinar as a training opportunity to really improve your skills in administrating the Therefore system from a security point of view. So what is role-based access control? So here at Therefore, we have a security concept called role-based access control, also known as RBAC. In RBAC, security is based on roles that are assigned to the users and groups within the organization. A role is a set of permissions that are grouped together with a given name and description. Security in Therefore can be applied on 4 objects in Therefore: categories, documents, cases, and workflow. Of course, security is also extended to the sub-objects within those designations, including many smaller permission sets, such as keyword dictionaries, dashboards, reporting, searches, annotations, and much more. So why do we use RBAC? So employees should only be allowed to access the information necessary to effectively perform their job duties. Access can be based on several factors, such as the authority, responsibility, and job competency. In addition, access to Therefore resources can be limited to specific tasks, such as the ability to view, create, or modify a file. As a result, lower-level employees usually do not have access to sensitive data if they do not need it to fulfill their responsibilities. This is especially helpful if you have many employees and use third parties and contractors that make it difficult to closely monitor network access. Using RBAC will help in securing your company's sensitive data and important applications. So RBAC was first introduced in Therefore 2020, where it replaced the previous access mask concept. RBAC is more agile and easier to manage. When we first introduced RBAC, we ensured that there was a solid upgrade and transfer process in place so people who were using the previous security concept could easily transfer to the new modern RBAC one. I'm not going to cover that transfer process in today's webinar, but if you do want to learn more about it, I'd be happy to give you some resources that will help explain exactly how the upgrade process works. Just send me an email or send me a message, and I'll make sure just to show you that video. So role-based access control should be created after careful analysis of the company's security landscape. Usually that means you can take advantage of the existing security concept when designing Therefore security. For example, how does their internal IT department manage their Active Directory? What groups and folders already exist? Usually this will already provide you with a good foundation for creating the security concept within Therefore. Did you know that it's possible to give users different roles in different categories and cases? So for example, in our internal Therefore system, which we use as ourselves in a production system, I have full admin rights on the categories and workflows related to the media digital engagement team. But I don't have any rights at all to even view any of the categories used by the finance or customer service team, right? Because I'm not in those departments. And it's the same thing. In the other production systems, we also recommend that you really look at what rights do the employees actually need to have in order to perform their jobs. It's important that there's at least one user who has administrator rights on the system to ensure that the system can always be fully accessed. Hence, we recommend to limit who has admin rights on the categories to ensure modifications are always done with thought and care. After all, it doesn't make much sense to have the Therefore system in place if everyone's always changing things around, right? On the other hand, you should never restrict the administrator count, so you want to have one full admin who always has full admin rights on every Therefore object. So by default, Therefore includes 5 roles. These are roles that come ready with the system. And the roles are the administrator, as you can see in the screenshot. They have full rights to do everything that you see here. They can administrate, operate, access, set permissions, search, and manage dashboards. They do it all. Power user. This user can view and edit documents, save new documents, participate in workflows, and administer the Therefore system in the Solution Designer. But they cannot set permissions and change the configuration of objects. The next one is the contributor. This user can view and edit documents, save new documents, and participate in workflows. They cannot administer the Therefore system or change permissions. This is a common role for users who will participate in workflows and save and edit documents. Then we also have the writer role. They can basically just save documents and view documents. They can also participate in workflows. And finally, the reader role. They can only view documents, no editing or workflow. Now, those are the 5 standard roles that come with every Therefore system. But if none of the 5 preset roles work for you, you can easily create a custom role if you have admin permissions. You can create a new role from scratch, amend an existing role, or use one of the preset roles as a basis for the new one. It's totally up to you. Therefore gives you the power to create the roles that fit the precise needs of your company. In the GIF, you can see how it's done using an existing role. Simply open the roles node, select copy role, and then select the permissions that you would like to provide to that new role. And then select the name for the new role, and the new role will then be visible under the roles node. So in this GIF, you can see we're creating a new role called Reader with Annotations, and we're taking the reader role and just adding the annotation permissions to that role. And then you can see in the final screen that the Reader with Annotations role is then visible in the Solution Designer. So it's a very easy and fast way to create new roles. And then of course, once you have those roles, you assign the individual users and groups that role. It could also be that you have a Therefore system that has a lot of users on it. You can easily compare the different functionalities that the roles have. You open them up, then you select 2 while holding Shift on your keyboard, select the 2 roles that you want to compare, and then you can actually see what is the difference between those 2 roles. So in this screenshot here, what you can see is I'm comparing the power user role to the contributor role. And you can see that in comparison, the power user has more permissions than the contributor. Power user has the operator, manage searches, dashboards, reopen cases, and view all instance permissions, whereas the contributor does not. So that's important, especially if you have a lot of custom roles. It's easy to forget what the differences are between those. So now moving on, overlapping roles. So Therefore is designed so that if a user is assigned several roles on a single object, they will always have the maximum amount of permissions assigned. All users need to first have permissions on the root node, which is in the Solution Designer, the little Therefore symbol at the top. and that's to give them just access to the system in general. So the easiest way to do that is just to create a big group where you put all your users inside and give them all the reader role on the root node. Then, once they have that, then you can fine tune the permissions within the categories and workflows, etc. And of course, if a user is assigned multiple roles on a single object, they will always have the maximum permissions based on those two roles. So for example, if they have a reader role on all categories and the power user role in HR, they'll be the power user in HR because they always have the maximum amount of roles that they are assigned to get the maximum amount of permissions. And this is typical because we always have inherit permissions. So any permissions that are given at the top are going to be inherited by the lower levels of the objects. So what I'm going to show you now is a video which I prepared for the e-learning course. It's called Overlapping Role Assignments, and it really nicely shows how the security concept is applied and how it is received by the users. So I will just quickly share my my video, and then you'll be able to see the overlapping roles. Okay, and if I do believe that you should be able to hear the video. If you cannot hear it for any reason, please send me a message, but I do believe that it should work. Okay, one moment. I'm going to share my screen again.
Overlapping roles. What happens if the same user is assigned two different roles with overlapping permission sets? To demonstrate, I'll use an incoming mail category where mail is saved and sorted according to department. First, let's check the roles assigned to the category. We're now going to break inheritance and remove any previous groups and permissions. We will now add Andrew Ross as both a power user and a reader. So you'll remember that the reader role is included in the power user role. Anything a reader can do, a power user can also do. A reader can only view the documents, and a power user can view, save, edit, and process documents. So what will happen when Andrew logs into the navigator? Well, he can view the index data. No surprise there, because that's the permission set common to the reader and power user roles. But you'll notice the background color of the index fields are white, meaning he can edit them. Also, if you view the top toolbar, you can see the Edit Document command has been enabled. This shows the more powerful role takes precedence. If a user has been given various roles, the role with the greatest permission set will be the one that is used. Now, in contrast, I want to demonstrate an example where roles are assigned that do not overlap. Here, once again, with the same user, Andrew Ross, and the same category, we'll remove all previous permissions. We will now reassign the power user role to Andrew Ross under the condition that the department is not HR. Using less than and greater than, like you see here, means excludes. And then we'll also give Andrew the reader role when the department is equal to HR. So let's test. Andrew Ross just logged into the navigator. He first opens up a document where the department is HR. You can see the top toolbar has grayed out options like Edit Document or Assign Task because those permissions were not granted in the reader role. You'll also notice the background of the index fields is gray because you cannot change the index data on those HR documents. In contrast, if we open a document from the legal department where Andrew has power user permissions, he can edit the index data as shown because the fields are white, edit the document, or start a new task.
All right. So that was a quick little video on overlapping roles. And it is something that I do think is really important to know because it's so important to be able to understand how the role concept works in therefore. So let me just check if there's any questions. I don't see any. So let's move on to the next slide. One thing that you noticed in the previous video is that I was copying permissions. So like I mentioned before, the permissions are trickled down from the root node or from the higher object in the solution designer. And so that means if you want to, this is called inheritance. And if you want to change the permissions that are inherited from the higher object, you will have to break inheritance. Means that you will have to click this little box here to uncheck it. Then the next dialog that you'll see is that it will ask you, do you want to copy or remove the permissions? I recommend that you always select copy. That means the previous permissions that would have been applied will be copied, and then you can individually remove those permissions. The reason why you want to copy rather than remove everything is because when you click remove, everything will be removed, including the administrator. And of course, you never want to restrict the administrator's rights. And so therefore, it's much better to copy and then individually remove the permissions to ensure that the administrator isn't lost completely. Moving on, it's also possible to add conditions on roles. Conditions on roles allow you to really fine-tune the roles and the security within therefore. One common example of this is that you can say that they only have permission on a certain document if the email index data matches the email associated with that user's email address with their login credentials. This is what we're showing here in the GIF here. The email has to equal the user mail. That means that the user can only access then their own documents. Commonly, this is in HR, for example, where you want to give users the reader role only to view their own HR documents, but you don't want them to have the permission to view other people's documents. You can also use operands like less than, greater than, or equal, like we saw in the previous video. This means that you can give people certain permissions only if, for example, an invoice amount is less than a certain amount, the department is HR, and less than, greater than, and this combination that you see here means is not or excludes. I have another video on this topic that really goes into detail how to apply security, and I'll show it to you right now. Just set up the So we're going to go to general security. Okay, now I have to start the screen again. Screen share, screen 2. There it goes. And play.
General security scenario 1. In this first scenario, we're going to restrict access to HR files. Only members of the HR team will be able to access the employee case file, called employees. You can see here the case header contains personal and employment data about each employee. A category within the case, called employment contracts, also contains the contract data, including contract number, starting salary, and a checkbox called confidential. This checkbox will be used to further restrict access. Another category, benefits, includes data about various benefits the employee may receive, like a car, health insurance, childcare and fitness, And finally, the third category within the case is for payslip data. Let's go. First, we'll open the Navigator, where you can see the employee files have been created for the employees Simone Smith, Nancy Davis, Harry Evans, Elizabeth Worth, and Andrew Jackson. Keep in mind, Nancy and Harry are both members of the HR team, whereas the other employees are not. The members of the HR team should be able to see all HR files, whereas other employees should not. Next, we'll inspect the employment contracts category. Here you can see that only Andrew Jackson's contract is confidential. Later, we'll use this checkbox to further restrict permissions so this file isn't visible at all. When we first open the category's index data, you can see the confidential checkbox is checked. Now let's go back to the Solution Designer to configure the permissions. The writer role for the internal user group was inherited from the root node. We will now break inheritance and select Copy to copy the permission set previously assigned. It's very important to select Copy. Even though we will now delete the permission sets, we want to make sure that the administrator role is left intact. This is very important. The admin's permissions should never be restricted. Otherwise, you may accidentally restrict yourself from even accessing the system, and then nobody else will be able to help you out. Now let's select Add and add the contributor role for the HR group. The contributor's role allows members to add and delete files, which would be important for members of the HR team. For now, we'll leave the condition blank. Next, we'll add the reader role. We want employees to be able to view their own HR file. Thus, we'll add a condition to the role assignment. All internal users are made readers for the HR case file, but the condition is that the employee email is the same as the email associated with the email account used to log into Therefore. This means that employees can only see their own files in the system. To prove this, I'll open up SQL and show you how the email is stored in the database. You can see the table entry for the user includes the employee email address. Thus, this is a very secure and effective way to limit access to only users being able to see their own files. Now let's log into the system as various employees to check what they can see. First, Nancy Davis will log in, who is a member of the HR team. She has the contributor role and should be able to view all employee files. We'll log in with the dynamic web viewer, and when we open the employment contracts category, you can see all employee files are visible. Now we can log out of Nancy's account and log in as Simone. Simone is not a member of the HR team. She only has a reader role on the category and can only view her own HR file. So when she opens the category, the only document she can see is her own file. And finally, let's log on as Andrew Jackson. Andrew is a member of the finance team and can only see his own files. Now you may recall that we had checked that his file was confidential. Now let's add a second condition so that confidential records cannot be seen by users with reader permissions. So we'll reopen the Solution Designer and we'll open the security settings for the employment contracts category. To add a second condition, we'll type and confidential equals 0. Remember, confidential was a checkbox. If a box is checked, the value is 1 and unchecked is 0. So as long as the box is not checked, you can have reader role. But Andrew Jackson's file was checked, so the value is 1. Now we'll select OK to apply the changes. Let's test. When we log in as Nancy Davis, a member of HR, she can still see all the employment contracts. However, when Andrew Jackson logs on, he can no longer see his own records because the confidential checkbox was checked.
All right, that was a very brief introduction to the adding conditions. I hope that was interesting and that the video worked quite well for you. So I do have a question. Let me just read it. Can we have role-based access of eForms in therefore? That's a really great question. So the way that eForm access is given, it's connected to the categories itself. So there is no separate permission set currently for eForms. It's included within the reader-writer role. But if you'd want to have more finely tuned permission abilities for eForms, that is something that we can definitely put a feature request in for. So of course, in order to save an eForm data to a certain category in therefore, you need to have the permissions to save data in that category. And that's currently how we are doing the permissions with eForms. It's also possible to make eForms not available for anonymous access. So you can also have control over who has access to eForms by ensuring that there is no anonymous use case for them. But that is a very good question. So thank you very much. I hope I answered that. But of course, there's always more room for improvements, and we love to have new feature requests. All right, so going back to our presentation here, this was showing exactly how you can create custom permissions so that users only have permissions to see their own documents. And what we had done here is we had said they have the role only if the user email address is the same as the email address used to log into the therefore system. And the reason why this is a very secure way to create that kind of permission is because we're actually using the email address that's in the SQL database. So we can also use groups and folders to fine-tune permissions. So groups and folders are really essential to administrating therefore security, particularly in larger companies. Of course, if the business only has a very small number of employees, you can manually assign permissions on an individual basis. But as soon as the company grows larger, it will no longer be feasible to manage security without using groups and folders. So what you do is you create groups in therefore for the different departments or user groups, and then use those groups to manage the security settings. So for example, employees in the marketing department can have power user roles in all the categories in the marketing folder, where other employees may only have reader rights on those. And as shown in the video, and as mentioned many times, we do use inheritance so that we can transfer the permissions from the parent object. And this was done with that checkbox, as you guys saw in the video and I mentioned before. And here, this is the root node, as you can see here. You right click, add security, and then create the user groups and rules on the base node there. You can also change a user's permission for the duration of a workflow task if that user doesn't already have permissions to read or change the document or index data through the regular role assignment. This should only be used for users who don't have permissions through the standard RBAC role. What you do is you open a manual user task in workflow, and then you can, under permissions, give them read and change access for the duration of that workflow task. So that allows somebody, for example, who normally only has writer permissions to have read and change permissions while they're completing that workflow task. Maybe their task is to check the index data or something like that. Now let's move on to a slightly different but related topic in therefore, which is license types. So as I'm sure many of you already know, there are 3 different types of user licenses available in therefore: concurrent, named only, and read only. Concurrent and named licenses can have any role. The only difference is that a concurrent license is part of a license pool. So when a user stops using therefore, the license is returned and can be used by another user. In contrast, the named license is tied to a specific user and can only be used by that person. Thus, it's a license point typically reserved for people who need to use therefore very regularly. Keep in mind that the number of concurrent licenses on your system refers to the number of users who can access therefore simultaneously, and not the total number of user accounts. So typically when you're thinking about how many concurrent licenses we need, depending on how often people use it, maybe you can have one concurrent license that will be shared by 3 to maybe 5 different people. Then we also have the read-only user license, which is a license that only allows that specific user to read content and therefore. This is a lower cost license and it's assigned to one specific user. The important thing to remember is with a read-only license, regardless of what rights the read-only license is given, they will only be able to view documents, always. The distinction between a read-only user and the reader role should be clear. A read-only license is a permanent distinction that cannot be changed, regardless of which roles or permissions are granted, whereas the reader role is a specific permission set that can be changed as long as the user license type is a named or concurrent license. Any questions on that? Oh, I got some questions. What role is enabled to support and start-stop services with the Therefore console? I believe it's administrator. You need to have the roles to administrate the system. Oh, I got another really good comment here from Jan, commenting, please add the function override permissions from parent object. When you copy the rights, sometimes you make a mistake and remove the admin role. Yes, like I mentioned, this is tricky. Or previously the admin was gone from the company and now you have no access. Yes. So it would be, I agree with you, Jan, it would also be great to have another function to be able to say like never remove this role, to have like, administrator at therefore.net and have say never remove this permission. That would be also really nice. If anyone is having one concurrent user of Essentials version, how many logins can be created? Is there any restriction? No, there is no restriction. So if you have one concurrent license, that means one person can use the Therefore system at a time, but you can have as many different user accounts in the system as you want. So what I'll show you, so concurrent and named license. So what you can do is you can check in your system, go right click on there, select license, and then you'll be able to see how many licenses you have. And my demo system right now that I was using to make all these demos for the videos, it has 3 concurrent users. But of course, as you saw in the video, I think I have like 30 different users on that system, or 20. I really have a lot of different users on that system. And that's just because I have a concurrent user. So 3 people can use the system at one time, but I can create as many user accounts as I want. It just means that 3 people can use it at one time. Yeah, and the number of users can exceed the number of concurrent licenses on the system. Does that answer your question, Tuhin? Then we add another question from Venus, using email equals the user mail. Does the inherent role checkbox must be checked or unchecked? It's not, that doesn't have any effect. If you want to inherit the roles, it just means that the previous role assignments from the parent object will be transferred to that object, but you can uncheck it and you can change it as you want. So that's a different feature. What is the meaning? Then I got another question here. What is the meaning of the maintenance only option? I don't know what the maintenance only option is. So you're going to have to maybe clarify a little bit. And then what is the meaning of maintenance until? That just means how long the license is valid for. If you have a on-premise system, you can be playing the CSS until a certain date. And if you have Therefore Online, it means just how long your subscription is valid until. All right, moving on to the next slide. Yeah, so you can check your license types. Anyone here on the call, you can open up your Therefore system right now and check. And finally, we're moving on to tips and tricks. So at least one person in every department should have the rights to reroute workflows and do basic admin tasks, such as add a keyword. Really important. If you have good users in your system, it's really helpful to be able for them to step in case the workflow has an error. You want to be able to reroute it to a different user. That just takes the pressure off of having one single admin in the system. It's really helpful if you have users who can do little small changes locally. It's also helpful to be able to add a keyword. And the really nice thing is that you can actually add new keywords to your Therefore system directly from the navigator. So if you have this is a category here, and you have a keyword, you right click on the drop down, and if you have the permission, you can add a new keyword right from the user interface. You don't need to open the solution designer. So that's a really convenient way to help users make their user experience better. The only thing that I would caution about is if you are giving users the ability to add new keywords to help classify the documents when they're being saved, think about if that keyword is also being used for your workflow transitions, because if users are using that keyword as a workflow transition, it could create an error if all of a sudden they add a new keyword and then there's no valid transition for the workflow. So in that case, you need to make sure that you always enable an else condition on the workflow here. So in case there's a new keyword added, the workflow will still have a valid path to follow. Are you guys with me here? Are these tips and tricks making sense? So just make sure, yeah, if you add a new keyword and that keyword is vital for a workflow transition, check that box so that there's always a valid workflow path. There we go. Another thing I'd recommend is you can customize the roles to improve user adherence and functions. So for example, you can remove printing or export rights to ensure the documents remain in the system. If you find out that a lot of users are exporting the documents and they're not saving them into the Therefore system, just take away their rights, okay? Force them to use Therefore. Also, make sure that you're using good category design practices. For example, making the fields mandatory to ensure that documents are fully indexed. That's really important. And always test role configurations before going live. That should go without saying, but test. Make sure that you're actually giving people enough rights to do their jobs and that you're ensuring that you have a high degree of security so that people can only see what is absolutely necessary. That concludes my presentation. Like I said, it's a pretty short and sweet webinar today. I will just check the final Q&A and then I will let you go. Apart from the super admin, is it possible to have another admin that is assigning permissions to other users only? Yes, you can have as many people have an admin as you want. You can also create a group of admins and have that group be responsible for creating permissions. So that is definitely possible. And I got a very nice message. Thank you for your activities. Thank you, Jan, for your nice words. What are your tips for organizing roles when there are a lot to create and diversify? So my first tip is, one, look at their existing infrastructure, what they were doing before Therefore came in. Oftentimes you could probably use their Windows security concept for Therefore, at least to know what groups there are and how that's divided. Number two is ask them. Say, what do you expect to be able to do in Therefore? And then also match it to their level of training and knowledge of the Therefore system. For example, if nobody knows how to administer the Therefore system, they don't know how to use the solution designer, it doesn't make much sense to give them the rights to be an administrator if they're not actually going to be able to use it. And finally, a lot of the times those roles will grow and change over time. And so it's important to work together with your customer hand in hand to make sure that you're actually designing the system to fit their needs. And it's going to change every time. All right, done. Okay, and then Jan also had another comment here on adding an option for displaying what the rule contains. Yeah. And he says it's too, basically to summarize what Jan is saying, there's too many clicks to see what rules are contains, and so he would like to have a better visibility on the rules. Yeah, like I said, there's always room for improvement, and it's really great to get all these good ideas. But in the end, I hope that this quick little webinar was a good start for most of you, and I'd like to encourage, for those of you who have a extranet account, to go ahead and go through the security course on the extranet. If you don't have access to the extranet, maybe you're an end customer, please contact me, media@therefore.net or jennifer.schmidt@therefore.net, and I'll be happy to give you the slides from today or any video content that you're looking for. So once again, thank you for, oh, Venus asked another question before I close up. Venus is asking for overlapping rules, the more powerful rule will always take precedence. Yes, so you will always have the union of, if you have two different rules, the user will always have the union of the two rules that were assigned. So they'll always have the maximum of permissions. I hope that clears everything up. So if you have two rules, the user will always have the maximum amount of permissions that they were assigned. And that's it. So once again, thank you for spending some time with me. I hope this was educational and beneficial to you. Have a really great day. Thank you. Bye-bye.